When people say cursor found the right files, what they usually mean is that the user and the runtime narrowed the search space fast enough inside the editor. That is a much more cursor-specific story than just saying the model understood the repo. In practice, the useful flow starts with a failing test, one or two explicit @ references, and then a search pass that cursor can verify in the terminal. That is the frame for this video. I do not want to treat cursor like a generic coding agent with a different logo. I want to show the actual controls cursor gives you to steer file selection before the patching loop starts. This is one of the biggest differences between cursor and the more opaque agent products. Cursor gives you very obvious handles for steering context. At Files says, read this exact file first. At Folders says, stay in this region. At Codebase says, retrieve likely relevant code instead of waiting for a guess. At Git, can bias the loop toward the current diff and repo state. That is why cursor often feels more controllable to engineers who already know roughly where the problem lives. You're not only prompting the model, you're editing the evidence stack before the agent starts making strong assumptions. Project rules are one of the reasons cursor deserves its own explainer instead of a copy of the codex story. The docs now describe .cursor/rules as the main persistent instruction surface with different attachment modes depending on whether the rule should always apply or only show up for certain tasks. The same docs also support a root AGENTS.md for broader repo defaults. The important cursor-specific point is that these rules are not abstract philosophy. They bias the agent before search and retrieval start. If the repo says generated clients are off limits, checkout bugs usually live under 2 folders. And verification must run through one test command. Cursor has a much better default search posture before you type another word. This distinction matters a lot. At Files is basically the user saying start here. Codebase search is the runtime saying, here are the likely neighbors. Those are different operations. Cursor's current search docs describe indexed recall over chunked code. Means the runtime can bring back a short set of semantically relevant snippets instead of pretending one huge file paste is the same thing as understanding. Long files get chunked and re-ranked. .cursorignore matters on this path too. It tells the search system which low-value files should not even compete. That combination is much more specific than the generic claim that the agent somehow just knows the repo. This is the most useful cursor mental model in one frame. The user can pin evidence directly with @ references. Project rules bias what the agent should trust or avoid. Codebase search proposes nearby code. Then the terminal and diff tools tell cursor whether the first guess was actually right. I'm still using the phrase working set here. It is a good engineering shorthand. But the cursor-specific lesson is that the evidence stack is partly under your control. You can steer it before the model goes wandering. This is where cursor stops looking like an editor chatbot and starts looking like an engineering tool. The runtime can open the pinned file, compare it against search results, and then immediately test the hypothesis in the terminal. That is very different from a system that only rearranges text in a side panel. Cursor's agent docs emphasize plan and execute behavior, and the newer subagent path pushes that further by letting narrower workers handle parts of the task. The practical point is simple. Cursor should not be trusted. It retrieved a file. It should be trusted after the terminal, and the patch agree about the same bug path. This is the most practical cursor lesson in the whole video. If cursor opens the wrong file first, do not keep arguing in natural language, and hope the next guess improves. Point it harder. Pin the first suspect file with @files. Narrow the region with @folders. Use Codebase search for the neighboring retry logic. Then give it fresh terminal evidence from the failing test. That is how experienced cursor users recover quickly when the first search pass is off. The product is strongest when you treat those controls like instruments, not decorations. Background agents are worth keeping in this story. They prove the architecture is really cursor specific and not only an editor trick. The cloud worker still clones the repo, applies the same rules, runs the same search logic, and verifies through terminal work on a branch. The difference is not the search model, the difference is where the loop runs and how the handoff comes back to you. That makes the point stronger. Cursor's file finding behavior is part of a broader runtime, not just a one-off editor feature. The practical takeaway is much more about using cursor well than about praising the model. Keep.cursor/rules short and operational. Use a root agents.md only when the instruction really is repo. Ignore the junk. Point the agent at the exact file or folder when you already have a strong suspicion. Then use Codebase search for the neighboring logic instead of using it as a substitute for precision. That is how you get a more cursor native workflow. Direct the evidence first, then let the agent prove the patch.